All right, so we're diving back into the South China Sea today. Looks like things are heating up again,
Yeah, definitely. Lots of tension brewing.
especially with the Philippines, right? They seem to be taking a much tougher stance against China lately. At least that's the impression I'm getting from these articles you send over.
You're right, there's definitely a shift in their approach.
It looks like they're trying to counter what they're calling China's gray zone tactics. Not exactly a term you hear every day.
No, it's not. It's a bit of a tricky concept.
Well, that's why we're here,
Right.
right? To break it down for our listeners. So, what exactly are these gray zone tactics? Help me understand this.
Okay, so gray zone tactics. They basically refer to actions that put pressure on a country, but like without actually going to war.
Okay, yeah, I'm following so far.
It's like pushing boundaries, testing how committed the other side is, trying to get what you want without actually sparking a full-blown conflict.
It sounds like walking a very fine line.
It definitely is, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Because it can easily escalate. One little miscalculation and things could spiral out of control.
And we've got two really interesting articles here, both from December 9th, 2024. One's from Naval News and the other's from Asia Times. Both really dive into this whole gray zone situation.
Yeah, they offer some really good insights.
So maybe we can use those articles as a starting point. Can you give us a real-world example of what this gray zone looks like in action? Something that really brings it to life for our listener.
Sure. Well, there was that incident on December 4th where Chinese Coast Guard vessels, they actually fired water cannons at a Philippine ship.
Wait, really? Water cannon?
Yeah, and they even sideswiped the Philippine vessel. It happened near Scarborough Shoal. It's a really important area for both countries, so it's sensitive.
You can imagine.
And of course, both China and the Philippines, they both claim this shoal as their territory. It's been a source of tension for years.
So the Philippine ship, was it like a military vessel?
No, actually, it was just a ship from their Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. Basically, they were just doing their job, surveying fishing grounds, making sure everything was in order.
So just routine stuff. And China's response was to attack them with water cannons.
Pretty much. And, I mean, China claims they were acting professionally and within their rights. They said the Philippine ship was intruding into their territorial waters.
And how did the Philippines react to this?
They definitely didn't take it lightly. Jonathan Malaya, a spokesperson for their National Security Council, he called it a steep escalation. That's pretty strong language.
Yeah, it is. It sounds like they're drawing a line in the sand. So what are they doing about it? Are they just protesting or are they taking more concrete action?
Well, it seems like they're considering a whole range of options. They're definitely trying to figure out how to respond to these gray zone tactics.
It sounds like a real dilemma. How do you respond to aggression that's designed to stay below the threshold of war?
Right. It's like you don't want to overreact, but you also can't just let them walk all over you.
Hmm.
So the Philippines, they're looking at different ways to push back without, escalating things too much.
So what are they considering?
Well, one idea is to basically match China's tactics, like, deploying their own naval assets more regularly, making their presence known. Philippine Navy Vice Admiral Jose Ma Ambrosio Ezpeleta has even suggested they should consider using similar tactics against China.
Wow, so they're thinking about fighting fire with fire. But isn't that incredibly risky, especially given the power imbalance? I mean, China's navy is way bigger and more powerful than the Philippines.
It's true. It's definitely a risky strategy, but it also shows just how seriously they're taking the threat.
It's like they're realizing that hoping China will just back down. Well, that's not really a strategy.
Exactly. They need to be
Yeah.
proactive, show that they're not going to be intimidated.
Okay, so fighting fire with fire is one option. What else are they thinking about?
Well, they're also talking about enhancing their maritime domain awareness.
Okay, now you're just using fancy words to make me feel dumb. What exactly is maritime domain awareness? Break it down for me and for our listener.
Sure. Basically, it means knowing what's happening in your waters. Think of it like having a really good security system, but for the ocean. It's about tracking ships, understanding who's out there and what they're up to.
So, like having eyes in the sky and ears in the water.
Exactly. Because if you can see what's coming, you can be ready for it. It's crucial for countering these gray zone tactics because it gives you the information you need to anticipate and respond to potential threats.
So, knowledge is power in a situation like this. It sounds like they're taking a multi-pronged approach.
They are. They're realizing that it's not just about military might. It's also about intelligence, strategy, and importantly, building alliances.
Ah, yes, the power of teamwork. There's strength in numbers, right? Especially when you're going up against a giant like China. So who are they teaming up with?
Well, the U.S. and Japan are definitely key players here. In fact, right after the water cannon incident, the Philippines conducted joint naval drills with both countries in the South China Sea.
Now, that's what I call sending a message. What exactly were they doing in these drills?
The drills included ships and aircraft from all three countries. The Philippines had their BRP Andres Bonifacio, which is a Navy ship, and a C-90 aircraft. Japan sent their JS Samader destroyer. And the U.S. had a P-8A Poseidon, which is pretty impressive maritime patrol aircraft.
Wow, that's quite a lineup. It sounds like they're not messing around. But what about China? How have they reacted to all of this? I mean, surely they're not just sitting back and watching this happen.
Oh, they're definitely not happy about it. The Asia Times article quotes Ding Duo. He's a deputy director at China's National Institute for South China Sea Studies. And, well, he accuses the Philippines of stoking the South China Sea issue and creating trouble.
It sounds like a classic case of blaming the victim.
Yeah, a bit. He even suggests that the Philippines is deliberately trying to fuel this whole China threat narrative, like they're making it all up, just to make China look bad.
It seems like China's trying to control the narrative here, trying to paint themselves as the innocent party. But what about the other countries? I mean, you mentioned the U.S. and Japan. Are they just offering words of support, or are they actually doing something concrete to help the Philippines?
Well, it's definitely more than just lip service. The articles mention that the UK, Japan, Germany, and the US, they all issued statements condemning China's actions. And they all expressed support for the Philippines.
Okay, so there's definitely some international pressure building on China. But are these countries actually willing to put their money where their mouth is? I mean, are they willing to help the Philippines defend themselves if things get really ugly?
That's a good question. It seems the Philippines is pushing for stronger commitments, especially from the U.S. You know, they have a mutual defense treaty with the U.S., but they want to be sure that the U.S. will actually have their back if things escalate.
Ah, yes, the good old security guarantees. Always a tricky business.
And of course, there's the whole wild card of the incoming Trump administration. No one really knows how he'll handle this whole South China Sea situation.
Right, the Trump factor. Always unpredictable. It's like everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see which way he'll jump.
What does the Asia Times article say about how Trump might approach this?
Well, the author suggests that Trump might go in one of two directions. He can take a more hawkish approach, which would mean a more aggressive stance towards China.
So like more military muscle flexing, tougher sanctions, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Or he could go for a more transactional approach, which is more about, making deals, trying to negotiate some kind of agreement with China.
Interesting. So it could be all about military strength and confrontation, or it could be about wheeling and dealing, trying to strike some kind of bargain.
Right. And of course, there's always the possibility he'll do something completely unexpected. It's Trump, after all. That's the thing with Trump. You can never quite predict what he'll do next. It keeps everyone on their toes. And I'm guessing both China and the Philippines are trying to figure out how to position themselves to get the best outcome, depending on which way Trump decides to go.
Absolutely. It's a high-stakes game of chess, and everyone's trying to make the right moves.
It's like they're all trying to read Trump's mind, which is probably a fool's errand.
Yeah, probably. But it's understandable. The stakes are so high. And what happens in the South China Sea, it doesn't just stay there. It has ripple effects across the entire region, even globally.
We've talked a lot about these gray zone tactics, but so far it's all been very abstract. Can you give us a concrete example of what the Philippines might actually do to counter these tactics? Like, what would this look like in practice?
Sure. Well, let me think. One idea that's being floated is to rely more on what they call auxiliary forces. They're basically non-military ships and personnel.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So think about like large transport ships to resupply those remote outposts in the South China Sea, or fast patrol boats that can quickly respond to incidents.
Ah, so they're like the support crew, the ones working behind the scenes to keep the main players in the game.
Exactly. They're a force multiplier. And they allow the Philippines to project their presence without having to rely solely on their Navy, which, is limited.
Smart move. It's about working smarter, not necessarily harder. Are there any other unconventional tactics they're considering?
Well, they've also talked about expanding their use of drones.
Now, when you say drones, I'm picturing those little things delivering packages to my doorstep. Are we talking about the same thing here?
Not exactly. These are sophisticated military drones that can monitor vast areas, provide real-time intelligence. They can act as a deterrent just by being there.
It's like having eyes in the sky watching China's every move. That would definitely be a tactical advantage. But, I mean, can you imagine China's reaction? They'd probably accuse the Philippines of militarizing the region.
Oh, absolutely. China is likely to object to just about anything the Philippines does to strengthen its defenses. But, they can't just let China dictate their actions. They have a right to defend their territory, especially when they're facing these aggressive gray zone tactics.
It's a tough situation. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. You mentioned the Philippines is even considering acquiring the U.S. Typhoon missile system. That's a pretty significant move, isn't it?
It is. It would give them the ability to target Chinese assets in the South China Sea, potentially even reaching military bases on the mainland.
I can see why China's not too thrilled about that prospect. You mentioned earlier that a Chinese state-run media outlet called the Typhoon system aggressive in intent.
Right.
Why are they so concerned about this particular system?
Well, the Typhoon is a very advanced system. It has a long range and is highly accurate. It would basically change the game in terms of the Philippines' ability to defend itself.
It sounds like they're sending a clear message to China. They're not going to be pushed around anymore. But facing off against a superpower like China, it's still a David and Goliath situation.
It is. And that's why those alliances we talked about are so important. The Philippines needs strong partners if they're going to stand up to China.
Right. Because David might have taken down Goliath, but he probably wouldn't have stood a chance against a whole army of giants.
Exactly. And that's what the Philippines is facing here. It's not just a one-on-one confrontation. It's a much bigger and more complex situation.
We've talked a lot about the Philippines and China, but you mentioned that what happens in the South China Sea has implications for the entire region, even globally. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. Think about it. The South China Sea, it's a vital waterway for global trade. A huge percentage of the world's goods pass through those waters. If things get really bad there, it could disrupt supply chains, affect prices, even impact the availability of products all over the world.
Wow, so it's not just a regional issue. It's potentially a global crisis waiting to happen.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of global security. If China is allowed to just change the status quo in the South China Sea, unilaterally, it sets a very dangerous precedent. It basically undermines the whole idea of a rules-based international order, the system that has helped to keep the peace for decades.
Right. It's like saying that might makes right. And if that becomes the norm, well, it's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah. Because if it happens in the South China Sea, what's to stop it from happening elsewhere? It can embolden other countries to act aggressively, and then who knows where it ends.
It's like a domino effect. If one falls, the rest could follow.
Exactly. And that's why what's happening in the South China Sea, it's not just a regional dispute. It's a test case for the whole international system.
And the outcome of that test? Well, it could have far-reaching consequences, not just for the Philippines and China, but for all of us.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected, even if it doesn't always feel that way.
It's a reminder that what happens on the other side of the world can eventually come back to affect us all. So, the Philippines is facing this pressure from China, trying to navigate these gray zone tactics. And at the same time, they're dealing with a new and unpredictable U.S. administration with the incoming Trump presidency. It's a tough spot to be in. What can they do in the meantime? While they wait to see how things shake out with Trump.
Well, I think they're already doing a lot of the right things. They're strengthening their military, as much as they can. They're building those alliances like we talked about.
Yeah.
And I think importantly, they're raising awareness about what China's doing.
Right. Shining a light on these gray zone tactics so the world can see what's really going on.
Exactly. And they're also trying to secure stronger support from the U.S. and other allies.
Yeah.
But, beyond all of that, I think the most important thing they're doing is demonstrating a new level of resolve. A determination to stand up for their rights.
Resolve. That's a powerful word. It's about drawing a line in the sand and saying, enough is enough.
Exactly. They're not going to be bullied anymore. And that's a positive development. Not just for the Philippines, but for any country that believes in a rules-based international order.
So they're taking action, but the question remains, is it enough?
It's a big question. And the answer, well, it's not clear yet. A lot depends on what China does next and how the U.S. responds.
It's a tense situation full of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a bit like watching a slow-motion train wreck and hoping someone can figure out how to prevent a collision.
That's a pretty vivid image and a sobering thought. What strikes me as particularly interesting about all this is the Philippines' willingness to get creative. They're thinking outside the box and considering some unconventional approaches. They're not just relying on traditional military might. They're looking for new ways to counter China's gray zone game.
That's a really good point. I think that's a key takeaway here. They understand that this isn't a conventional conflict, it's a war of attrition, a war of nerves. And you need a different kind of strategy to win that kind of war.
Right. It's not about brute force. It's about outsmarting your opponent. It's like a real-life game of chess, but with incredibly high stakes.
Exactly. And the moves the Philippines make in the next few months, well, they could determine the outcome of the game. It's a fascinating situation to watch unfold. I have a feeling we're only at the beginning of a much longer and more complex story.
I think you're right. And it's a story that has implications far beyond the shores of the South China Sea. It's a story that the whole world is watching closely. Speaking of watching closely, these events in the South China Sea might feel far removed from your everyday life, but they have the potential to affect you directly. What does all of this mean for you, the listener, even if you're thousands of miles away?
That's a great question, and it's something we should all be thinking about. I mean, look, we've talked about how much of global trade goes through the South China Sea, right? Well, if tensions keep rising there, it could disrupt those shipping routes, which could mean higher prices and even shortages of goods that you rely on. It could hit your wallet and your lifestyle. So even though this might seem like something happening on the other side of the world, it has the potential to affect you in very real ways.
It's a reminder that we live in a globalized world. What happens in one place can have ripple effects everywhere.
Exactly. We're all connected. Really underscores how interconnected everything is these days. Even though it might feel far away, what happens over there can definitely have an impact on us here.
It's true. And it makes you realize that these aren't just abstract geopolitical issues. They have real-world consequences for everyone.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that the Philippines is exploring some unconventional tactics, maybe inspired by how India's dealt with its own border disputes with China. What did you mean by that?
Right, so India, they've had some success using what you might call non-lethal force to resist Chinese incursions. Not like full-blown military attacks, but more, physically blocking them or pushing back against them.
So like a kind of maritime shoving match?
Yeah, kind of. They're looking at ways to make it more difficult for China to operate in those disputed waters
Yeah.
without actually resorting to, firing weapons or anything like that.
Interesting. So it's about using force, but in a more strategic and measured way.
Exactly. It's about making it clear that they're not going to just back down, that they're willing to stand their ground.
It's like a game of chicken, but on the high seas?
Okay, so using auxiliary forces and maybe some of these non-lethal tactics, what else are they thinking about doing?
Well, there's also been talk about increasing their use of drones.
Drones, huh? I mean, I know they're becoming more and more important in modern warfare, but I still tend to think of those little things you see buzzing around parks taking videos. Are we talking about the same thing here? Not quite. We're talking about like sophisticated military drones. The kind that can monitor vast areas, provide real-time intelligence. They can even act as a deterrent just by their presence.
It's like having eyes in the sky, keeping watch over everything China's doing. I bet China loves that idea.
Yeah, they're probably not thrilled about it. But, I mean, the Philippines has a right to defend itself, and drones are a pretty effective way to do that, especially given the limited resources they have.
Makes sense. It's about leveraging technology to level the playing field. So we've got the auxiliary forces, the possible non-lethal tactics, the drones, and of course, there's still that whole Typhoon missile system they're considering, the one that China called aggressive in intent. I'm curious what exactly about this system has them so worried. What makes it so special or so threatening in their eyes?
Well, the Typhoon, it's a very advanced system. It has a really long range and is extremely accurate. I mean, we're talking about a system that could potentially target Chinese assets hundreds of miles away.
So not just ships in the South China Sea, but potentially even military bases on the mainland.
Yeah. I mean, that's why China's so concerned about it. It would basically shift the balance of power in the region, give the Philippines a much stronger deterrent capability.
It sounds like they're sending a pretty clear message. Don't mess with us. But still, facing off against a superpower like China, even with these new capabilities, it's got to be a daunting prospect.
It is. But that's why those alliances we talked about are so crucial. The Philippines can't do this alone. They need the support of the U.S. and other like-minded countries if they're going to stand up to China.
Because it's not just about military hardware, right? It's about having a united front, showing China that they can't just bully their way around the region. So the Philippines is bolstering its defenses, building alliances, trying to get creative with their strategy. It's a lot to juggle. But what about the bigger picture? We've talked about the impact on global trade, but what about the impact on global security? If China is allowed to get away with this, what kind of message does that send to the rest of the world?
Well, I think it sends a very dangerous message. It basically says that might makes right. That if you're powerful enough, you can just ignore international law and do whatever you want. And that's a recipe for chaos.
Because it undermines the whole idea of a rules-based international order, right? The idea that everyone plays by the same rules regardless of their size or power.
Exactly. And I mean, that system isn't perfect, but it's the best we've got. And if it starts to crumble, well, the consequences could be pretty dire.
It's like we're at a crossroads, and the choices we make now, the actions we take or don't take, they could determine the course of events for years to come. All of this talk about China's actions, it makes me wonder, what's their endgame here? What are they really trying to achieve? Is it just about control of the South China Sea, or is there something bigger at play?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, it's clear that they want to be the dominant power in the region. They see the South China Sea as their backyard, and they don't want anyone else interfering.
Right, it's all about asserting their dominance, showing everyone who's boss. But is that all it is, or is there something more strategic going on?
Well, I think it's also about resources. The South China Sea is rich in fish, oil, and gas. And China wants to secure those resources for itself. They're also looking to expand their military presence in the region, build bases, project power, that kind of thing.
So it's about economics, security, and just plain old power politics. A potent mix.
It is. And it's a mix that's making a lot of countries in the region very nervous.
It's like they're trying to create a new reality in the South China Sea. One where they make the rules and everyone else has to follow them. And the Philippines, well, they seem to be the ones standing up and saying, no, we're not going to play your game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that makes them a very important player in this whole drama. Because what happens with the Philippines could determine how this whole thing plays out.
It's like they're the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, in a way, they are. Because if they can stand up to China, if they can show that China can't just get away with bullying its neighbors, well, that could embolden other countries to do the same.
It could be the start of a pushback against China's growing assertiveness.
Exactly. But of course, it could also backfire. If China decides to make an example of the Philippines, if they really crack down hard, well, that could have the opposite effect. It could scare other countries into submission.
It's a high-stakes gamble, for sure. And the Philippines is right at the center of it.
They are. And it's going to be fascinating to see how they navigate this incredibly complex and challenging situation.
And how the rest of the world responds. Because this isn't just about the Philippines and China, it's about the future of the entire region and maybe even the world.
I agree. What happens in the South China Sea in the next few years? Well, it could have repercussions for decades to come.
Yeah, it really is a pivotal moment. And the stakes are incredibly high for everyone involved. It makes you realize that peace and stability, they're not a given. They're something you have to constantly work for, constantly defend.
Exactly. It's a constant balancing act. And right now, the scales feel a bit precarious.
It's like we're all holding our breath, watching to see which way things will tip. It's easy to feel powerless in situations like this. Like, what can one person do about these huge, complex, global issues? It can all feel so overwhelming.
I get that. It's definitely easy to feel that way. But I mean, even though it might not seem like it, individual actions do matter.
Yeah.
The first step is awareness. The more people understand what's at stake, the better.
Right. Knowledge is power.
Exactly. So, read those articles, have those conversations, educate yourself. And then, don't be afraid to use your voice. Talk to your elected officials. Advocate for policies that promote peace and stability.
So it's about staying informed, getting involved, and making your voice heard.
Exactly. It's about not just being a spectator, but being an active participant in shaping the world you want to live in.
And remembering that we're all part of a global community. What affects one of us can eventually affect us all. As we've been talking about all this, one thing that keeps coming back to me is the potential for miscalculation. What if one side misreads the other's intentions? Or what if someone overplays their hand? It seems like there's a lot of room for things to go wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Miscalculation is always a risk in these situations, especially when tensions are running high. Imagine a scenario where the Philippines, feeling emboldened by this newfound assertiveness and the support they're getting from their allies, they decide to take a more aggressive step. And, I don't know, maybe China misinterprets that move, sees it as a provocation, and decides to respond with force.
Yeah, that could spiral out of control very quickly. It could easily escalate into a full-blown conflict.
Exactly. And then, I mean, once things get to that point, it's really hard to pull back.
Right, because then pride and nationalistic feelings get involved. It's like a runaway train.
Yeah, it really is. And that's why it's so important for everyone involved to be cautious, to think things through carefully, and to keep those lines of communication open.
Because one wrong move could have devastating consequences, not just for the countries directly involved, but for the entire region, maybe even the world.
Absolutely. The stakes are incredibly high,
Yeah,
and everyone needs to be aware of that.
it's a sobering thought, and it highlights the importance of diplomacy, of dialogue, of finding ways to resolve these conflicts peacefully.
Couldn't agree more. We can't let things get to the point where military action becomes the only option.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about these gray zone tactics, the Philippines' response, the role of the U.S. and other countries, the potential for miscalculation, the broader implications for the region and the world. It's been a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, conversation.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final question to ponder. Will the Philippines' new assertiveness in the South China Sea ultimately lead to greater stability, or will it further escalate tensions in the region?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, I don't think anyone knows the answer for sure. It all depends on how the various players involved respond to this evolving situation.
It's like a giant game of chess with all these moving pieces, and every move has the potential to change the entire game.
Exactly. And the outcome is far from certain. But one thing is clear. What happens in the South China Sea in the coming months and years will have a profound impact on the region and potentially on the world.
So stay tuned, folks. The story is far from over. And thanks to our expert for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to be here.
And to our listeners, as always, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep engaging with the world around you. Your curiosity and your willingness to learn, well, those are the most powerful weapons we have against ignorance and apathy. Until next time.